The Civil War didn't start with gunfire, it started with ledgers. As cotton wealth exploded in the South and industry thrived in the North, America split into two economies shackled to a single flag. And when one side pushed to rewrite the rules, the other chose war. Long before Fort Sumter's first blast, the U.S. had already cracked, not along political lines but economic ones. Up north, industrial growth turned cities into manufacturing powerhouses. Railroads linked states, banks funded mills, and immigrants fed the demand for workers. The economy was pivoting toward machinery, investment, and paid labor. But down south, wealth had a single source: cotton. By the 1850s, it accounted for over half the nation's exports. The cotton gin had turbocharged output, and with it, the need for enslaved workers. Slavery wasn't merely a moral dilemma, it was the backbone of commerce. Plantations ran like vast corporations. A single Mississippi cotton farm could generate what would now be millions, all built on the forced toil of men, women, and children tallied as property. The South's reliance on slavery was so absolute that by 1860, 4 million people, a third of its population, were enslaved. Their sweat lined the pockets of planters, traders, insurers, and even northern financiers. This wasn't a secret. Southern leaders flaunted it. Mississippi's secession papers bluntly stated, "Our society rests on slavery." Yet abolitionist momentum grew in the North, fueled not just by ethics but economic anxiety. Small farmers and workers saw slavery as a danger to free labor. If plantations expanded westward, how could they survive? A moral rift had become a fiscal war. Every new state reignited the debate, slave or free. The 1820 Missouri Compromise had tried to split the difference. Missouri for slavery, Maine for freedom. But each fresh territory reignited strife. And by 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act shattered that uneasy truce. Settlers rushed to Kansas to sway its fate. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces collided, sparking the violence of Bleeding Kansas. The slavery dispute had turned bloody. Meanwhile, politics splintered. The Republican Party rose in the North, pledging to halt slavery's spread, not end it outright. Among its newcomers was an Illinois lawyer, Abraham Lincoln. When Lincoln won the 1860 election without a single Southern electoral vote, the South saw an economic death sentence. Their terror wasn't just ideological, it was financial. Without room to grow, slavery's economy would suffocate. So state by state, the South walked away. But the worst was yet to come. And if you appreciate stories that reveal the true drivers of America's past, like and subscribe. It fuels our work and keeps these vital narratives alive. South Carolina's secession in December 1860 wasn't just political, it was a fiscal manifesto. The South stood to lose everything: cotton riches, enslaved workers, regional dominance. For generations, Southern elites had crafted a financial order rooted in land and human bondage. Lincoln's victory threatened to dismantle it, so they bolted. Within weeks, 10 more states joined, birthing the Confederacy. They claimed Washington no longer served their economic survival. Their dread went beyond abolition. They feared obsolescence. In their own declarations, secession was framed as protecting their traditions. But beneath that rhetoric lay an economic system, one dependent on unpaid labor, unchecked profits, and fortunes built on bondage. Even Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens admitted it plainly. This wasn't about heritage, it was about money. Yet the South faced a critical weakness. It had no real military, no factories to speak of, and no way to borrow funds beyond its cotton revenues. The North, meanwhile, dominated 80% of America's manufacturing, 75% of its railroads, and nearly all its banking. Still, Southern leaders clung to one belief: cotton was their ultimate leverage. Cotton is king, they boasted, certain that Europe, especially Britain, would side with them to safeguard their textile mills. They miscalculated. As Confederate troops occupied federal armories and forts, Washington had to decide: compromise or fight. Lincoln, fresh into office, sought to de-escalate. He promised not to touch slavery where it already existed, but he also rejected the Confederacy's legitimacy. To Lincoln, secession wasn't merely defiance, it was an economic time bomb. A country couldn't survive with two currencies, competing trade laws, and rival governments on the same soil. The danger wasn't just ideological, it was fiscal chaos. And when Confederate cannons opened fire on Fort Sumter in April 1861, war erupted. Neither side was prepared. When hostilities officially began that April, there were no master plans, only hunches. Both Union and Confederacy assumed the fighting would be brief, over in months. They misjudged badly. The North held overwhelming advantages, 22 million people against the South's 9 million, nearly half of whom were enslaved and barred from service. It controlled factories, steel mills, weapons production, and naval power. It even had reliable money and credit. But one thing was missing: competent command. Lincoln's generals were relics, hesitant, outdated, and wedded to obsolete tactics. His first pick, General Winfield Scott, was a Mexican-American war legend, but so frail he couldn't mount a horse. His strategy, to strangle the South with a blockade, the Anaconda Plan, was shrewd but too gradual for an impatient public. The Confederacy faced shortages at every turn. Less industry, fewer funds, limited arms, but they fought with one crucial advantage: desperation. Defending home territory gave them familiarity with the land and fierce determination, complemented by gifted commanders like Robert E. Lee and the soon-to-be legendary Stonewall Jackson. Yet their logistical challenges proved crippling. The Southern economy had never been structured for warfare. Rail networks were sparse and primarily designed for cotton transport, not military supply. Most disastrously, their financial system collapsed as the Confederacy printed unbacked currency that foreign markets refused to recognize. Hyperinflation followed. By war's end, Confederate dollars were nearly valueless scraps. The Union, meanwhile, financed its war machine through taxation, government bonds, and a reformed banking system. The 1862 Legal Tender Act introduced standardized paper money, the famous greenback, giving Washington firm control over monetary policy. Where the South relied on printing presses, the North leveraged financial instruments. But economic superiority alone couldn't secure victories. That required battlefield strategy. The war's first major clash came in July 1861 at Bull Run. Overconfident Union troops advanced into Virginia as spectators gathered with picnic baskets, expecting a swift triumph. Instead, they met devastating resistance from Jackson's unyielding brigade, earning him his Stonewall moniker, and fled in disarray. The humiliating retreat shattered Northern illusions of a quick resolution. This sobering defeat forced Lincoln to seek new leadership. Enter General George B. McClellan, young, energetic, and wildly popular. He transformed the Union Army through rigorous training and organization. But his paralyzing caution became his undoing. McClellan consistently exaggerated Confederate numbers, refusing to attack even with overwhelming advantages. His endless requests for reinforcements frustrated Lincoln, who famously quipped, "If the general isn't going to use the army, I'd like to borrow it temporarily." A different approach emerged in the Western theater under Ulysses S. Grant. The taciturn Ohioan cared nothing for pomp or politics, only results. His early 1862 victories at Forts Henry and Donelson, earning his unconditional surrender nickname, demonstrated how industrial might could translate to military success. Grant pioneered innovative supply routes using river networks and railroads, driving deep into Confederate territory. Though his aggressive style drew criticism over high casualties, Lincoln defended him. "I can't replace this man. He actually fights." As Northern industry hit full stride, munitions factories churned out weapons, railroads moved entire divisions, and telegraphs enabled unprecedented coordination. The Union was industrializing warfare itself. Yet in the Eastern Theater, McClellan's Peninsula Campaign became an exercise in hesitation. Despite numerical superiority, his slow advance toward Richmond allowed Lee to rally defenses. When the Confederate commander launched his audacious 7 days battles counteroffensive, McClellan's nerve failed completely. McClellan's retreat didn't just represent a tactical failure, it marked the collapse of Northern hopes for a swift victory. Each day of prolonged warfare drained Union coffers and cost more lives, straining an economy now facing indefinite conflict. By summer 1862, the war's financial toll became unbearable, with monthly expenditures reaching millions for arms, troop transport, and soldiers' pay. While war bonds temporarily stabilized Northern finances, public support wavered as European powers watched intently. Britain and France, whose textile industries traditionally relied on Southern cotton, faced economic turmoil from the Union blockade that slashed 75% of their cotton imports. Confederate diplomats gambled on this cotton diplomacy to force European intervention, but their calculus proved fatally flawed. British warehouses held substantial cotton reserves, and more critically, supporting a slave-holding nation became politically untenable after the global impact of Uncle Tom's Cabin and reports of plantation brutality. Lincoln recognized the precarious international situation. European recognition of the Confederacy could mean financial backing, arms shipments, even military support. He needed a game-changing maneuver that would reframe the conflict globally. Emancipation emerged not just as moral imperative, but as strategic weapon, transforming the war from a sectional dispute into a crusade against slavery that would isolate the Confederacy diplomatically. But such a bold move required battlefield validation. The opportunity came in September 1862, when Lee's Maryland campaign culminated at Antietam. Though the bloodiest single-day battle in U.S. history ended tactically inconclusive, Lee's withdrawal gave Lincoln the necessary victory to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. When enacted on January 1, 1863, it declared all enslaved persons in rebel territories free, accomplishing three strategic objectives. 1. Neutralizing European interventionist impulses. 2. Depriving the Confederacy of international legitimacy. 3. Recasting the war's purpose beyond mere reunification. The proclamation's immediate effects were both practical and symbolic. While it technically freed only those in unconquered rebel areas, its psychological impact proved revolutionary. Nearly 180,000 African Americans, including many former slaves, would eventually join Union ranks, simultaneously strengthening Northern forces while crippling the Southern economy through mass desertions from plantations. As Confederate currency became worthless and food riots erupted in Southern cities, Northern industry reached unprecedented levels. Steel production soared, rail networks expanded, and Wall Street emerged as a permanent financial power through war bond sales. Yet these gains came at tremendous cost: mounting casualties, rising prices, and war weariness as the conflict entered its third year. Lincoln understood that true victory required more than Confederate surrender. It demanded the nation's transformation. "A house divided against itself cannot stand," had been his warning. Now he labored to rebuild that house on firmer foundations. As 1863 dawned, both sides prepared for the conflict's most devastating phase, one that would test not just military might, but the very soul of the American experiment. The Civil War didn't just decide the fate of a nation, it rewrote the rules of power itself. Cotton, cannons, and currency had all failed the South. But in the end, the most devastating weapon wasn't fired from a rifle, it was inked on a page. The Emancipation Proclamation didn't just free the enslaved, it shattered the Confederacy's economic spine, turning its greatest asset into its fatal weakness. Yet the war's true legacy wasn't just victory or defeat, it was a question. Can a nation built on two irreconcilable truths ever truly survive? The answer would be written in blood, steel, and fire, and its echoes would shape America for centuries to come. So tell us, what do you think was the Confederacy's fatal flaw? Arrogance, economics, or was it something deeper? Drop your thoughts below, and if you want the explosive, untold story of how the war really ended and why its shadows still linger today, smash that like and subscribe button. The next chapter will shock you.